The dining hall went dead silent the instant the wine glass hit the marble floor and broke into 100 pieces. Every head in the room turned toward the private banquet suite, where one of the wealthiest investors in the world had just brought his fist down on the table, so hard the silverware jumped. His jaw was clenched, his eyes were wide with fury. Across from him sat an interpreter, hands shaking, refusing to meet anyone's gaze. And near the entrance, holding a tray of untouched espresso cups, stood a tired single father who was about to do something that would put his entire future on the line, by saying 5 words out loud. "Sir, your interpreter is lying. Before we go further, if you believe an ordinary person can still change the course of someone else's life, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with us. Stories like this one deserve to be seen." The man holding that tray was Adrian Cole, 34 years old, and for the last 3 years his life had been one long stretch of exhaustion nobody around him ever saw. He'd lost his wife, Elena, to a sudden brain aneurysm when their daughter Mabel was only 5. Since that day, Adrian had carried every responsibility alone. He woke at 5 every morning to braid Mabel's hair, pack her lunch, walk her the 6 blocks to school, and then catch 2 buses to make it to his shift at the Averlin, one of the most exclusive hotels in the city. The pay barely covered rent and groceries, let alone the mounting medical bills he was still paying off. Some nights, after Mabel had fallen asleep clutching her stuffed rabbit, Adrian sat at the kitchen table doing math in his head that never quite added up. He never let Mabel see the weight of it. She thought her father was the strongest man alive, and he intended to keep it that way. What none of his co-workers knew, what none of the hotel's management had ever bothered to ask, was that Adrian held a degree in international relations and spoke 4 languages fluently: English, French, Mandarin and Portuguese. Before Elena's death, he'd been 2 years into a promising career as a trade negotiator, flying between cities twice a month, sitting in on deals worth more money than he could imagine at the time. Then came the phone call that changed everything. A headache Elena said felt different, a rush to the hospital, and 11 hours later, a doctor telling him there was nothing more anyone could have done. Grief didn't just end his career, it rearranged the entire shape of his life. There was no time to grieve properly, not with a 5-year-old asking where her mother had gone, not with bills that didn't pause for loss. Adrian sold the car first. Then most of the furniture from the apartment he and Elena had shared. He moved himself and Mabel into a smaller place near her school, took the first job that would hire him on short notice, and told himself it was temporary. 3 years later, it still was, in the way things become permanent by simply never being fixed. Now he refilled water glasses for a living, folded napkins into perfect swans for tables full of people who tipped generously and never once asked his name. Most guests walked past him without a second look. He'd stopped expecting them to. One humid Thursday, the Averlin was preparing for its most important booking of the year. A billionaire industrialist from Zurich named Nathaniel Graves had reserved the entire East Wing for a private negotiation. Graves was known across the business world for one thing above all. He funded struggling regions. His investment firm had rebuilt failing factories in 6 countries and created tens of thousands of jobs in places most investors had written off. If this deal went through, it would mean a new manufacturing hub for the region, and work for thousands of local families who badly needed it. The hotel staff had been preparing for a week. Managers walked the halls twice checking every place setting. The head chef personally tasted every dish 3 times. Security swept every entrance twice over. When Graves arrived, he brought with him an interpreter named Marcus Reyes. Since the local business consortium he was meeting with spoke primarily in their native tongue and Graves did not. Marcus had been recommended by a colleague on Graves's team just 2 weeks earlier, a late substitution after the firm's usual interpreter had taken ill. Nobody thought twice about the switch. There was no reason to. The meeting began ordinarily enough. Introductions were made over sparkling water and small talk about the weather. The regional business owners, 5 of them, representing manufacturing families who had worked the same trades for 2 generations, had waited months for this single afternoon. Everything they'd built their hopes on came down to the next 2 hours. Graves was there to finalize terms with a coalition of regional business owners desperate for the investment. Adrian was assigned to serve the private suite that day, quietly refilling glasses, clearing plates, staying invisible the way good service staff are trained to. But within 20 minutes, something felt deeply wrong. Adrian noticed that what Marcus was translating into English for Graves did not match what the local business owners were actually saying in their own language. At first he assumed he'd misheard. He told himself he was tired, that his ear was playing tricks on him, but the pattern didn't stop, it got worse. A polite counteroffer became, in translation, an insulting lowball demand. A respectful question about timelines became, in translation, an accusation of bad faith. Warm expressions of gratitude became, in translation, veiled threats. At one point, Theodora spoke gently about wanting to make sure her workers' pensions were protected in any new agreement, a reasonable, almost heartfelt request. Marcus turned to Graves and said, flatly, that she was demanding guarantees no investor would ever agree to and implying the deal was worthless without them. Graves's expression hardened instantly. Theodora had no idea why his tone had suddenly turned cold, and Marcus never so much as glanced her way while delivering the line. Adrian's stomach tightened. This wasn't a translator making innocent mistakes. This was a man deliberately poisoning every sentence that passed through him. The temperature in the room changed fast. The local business owners looked increasingly offended, glancing at each other in confusion, wondering why their generous, carefully worded proposals were being met with visible anger. Graves grew colder by the minute, his shoulders stiffened, his questions turned clipped and suspicious. Two of the local partners quietly excused themselves to take a call and never came back to the table. Adrian understood exactly what was happening. Someone in that room wanted this deal to collapse, and Marcus Reyes was the instrument making sure it did. He watched more closely now, no longer pretending to be just a waiter. He caught the small, almost invisible smirk Marcus gave after delivering a particularly cutting mistranslation. He noticed the pauses that were too long, too deliberate, like a man carefully choosing exactly which words would do the most damage. He noticed how Marcus never once glanced toward the local partners while translating their words. Because he wasn't actually listening to them at all. Somewhere in that hotel suite, a partnership that could have meant electricity, wages, and stability for thousands of families, was being quietly strangled to death, one false sentence at a time. Adrian thought about the manufacturing families sitting across the table. Men and women who had dressed in their best clothes that morning, who had rehearsed their proposal for weeks, who had no idea a single mistranslated sentence could undo 2 generations of work. He thought about how easily hope could be taken from people who never even saw it happening. Adrian's hands trembled as he set down a coffee pot. He was nobody in this room, a waiter, a name no one at that table would remember 5 minutes after the meeting ended. If he opened his mouth and got it wrong, or even got it right in the wrong way, he could be fired on the spot. No severance, no warning, just gone, and with him the rent, the medical bill, payments, Mabel's school fees, everything. But if he said nothing, thousands of people who needed those jobs would lose them before the opportunity ever reached them. Graves stood up abruptly, buttoning his jacket. Clearly done. This isn't the partnership I was told it would be, he said flatly, reaching for his briefcase. We're finished here. That was the moment Adrian stepped forward. His legs felt unsteady. His voice, when it came, cracked halfway through the sentence. Sir, your interpreter is lying. The room froze completely. Every single person turned toward him. 2 security guards standing near the door immediately straightened and started moving in his direction. The hotel's floor manager, watching from the hallway, went pale. For a long moment nobody spoke at all. Then Graves, without sitting back down, asked quietly, "What did you just say?" Adrian took a breath and told him everything. He repeated, word for word, in the original language, several of the exact phrases the local partners had used. Then he gave Graves the accurate English translation, side by side with what Marcus had actually said aloud minutes earlier. The difference was staggering. Confusion rippled through the room. Graves demanded a second, independent interpreter be brought in immediately, this time over video call from the consulate 2 blocks away. Within 15 minutes, the truth was confirmed beyond doubt. Marcus Reyes had been deliberately sabotaging the negotiation from the very first sentence. An internal investigation later revealed Marcus had been quietly paid by a rival firm that stood to lose a lucrative contract if Graves's investment went through. Derailing the deal wasn't a mistake. It was the plan all along, and it had almost worked, because of one exhausted waiter's willingness to stay quiet like everyone expected him to. Marcus was removed from the building by security within the hour, still insisting, all the way to the elevator, that it had all been an honest misunderstanding. Nobody in that room believed him, least of all Graves. The 5 business owners sat in stunned silence for a long moment after he was gone. One of them, an older woman named Theodora, who had run her family's textile mill for 30 years, walked over to Adrian and simply took both his hands in hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The meeting resumed that same afternoon, this time with a translator both sides trusted. For the first time all day, the conversation flowed the way it was always meant to, honestly, respectfully, productively. By evening, the agreement was signed. The investment moved forward exactly as it should have from the start, bringing new manufacturing contracts and, within the year, close to 4,000 new jobs to a region that had been waiting a long time for a reason to hope. But Nathaniel Graves couldn't stop thinking about the waiter who had risked his job, and possibly his family's stability, to speak up for strangers he owed nothing to. A week later, an envelope arrived at Adrian's apartment. Inside was a handwritten note and an invitation to meet Graves privately at his downtown office. Nervous and unsure what to expect, Adrian arrived at an office on the 40th floor, half convinced he was being called in to be reprimanded for speaking out of turn in front of a client. Instead, Graves stood up from behind his desk, shook his hand firmly, and gestured for him to sit. Over the course of that meeting, Adrian learned that Graves had spent the past week quietly looking into his life. His wife's passing, the daughter he was raising alone, the degree in international relations that had never been used, the 4 languages that had gone dormant for years while he carried trays instead of contracts. Graves admitted, almost sheepishly, that he'd asked the hotel's general manager for Adrian's personnel file the very next morning after the meeting collapsed and then reassembled itself. Most people in that room had every reason to protect themselves that day, Graves told him. You had more reason than anyone to stay quiet. And you were the only one who didn't. Graves saw something in Adrian that a resume alone could never show, integrity that didn't waver even when it cost something. 2 months later, Adrian accepted a position inside Graves's international trade division, using, for the first time in years, the exact skills he'd once trained so hard to build. His income changed almost overnight. He paid off the last of the medical debt within his first year. He moved himself and Mabel into a bigger apartment, one with a small yard where she could finally have the dog she'd been asking for since Elena passed. But the biggest change wasn't financial. Adrian started sleeping through the night again. The quiet exhaustion that had lived behind his eyes for 3 straight years began, slowly, to lift. He remembered, piece by piece, who he'd been before grief had narrowed his whole world down to survival. Mabel watched her father go from a man who came home too tired to talk, to a man who came home and told her, every single night, about the places his job was now taking him. Cities she'd only seen on a map, deals that would put food on other families' tables the way strangers had once, without knowing it, kept food on theirs. Almost 2 years later, Adrian stood beside Mabel at the opening of a new vocational training center, funded in part by the very investment deal he had once saved from collapsing in a hotel suite. Hundreds of local families filled the courtyard that day. Kids ran across a brand new playground. Workers who'd been unemployed 18 months earlier now had steady paychecks and steadier futures. Small businesses that had been barely surviving were finally growing. All of it traced back to one moment, an exhausted single father choosing to say something true, even when silence would have been so much safer. Theodora was there too, older now, her textile mill running 3 shifts a day for the first time in a decade. She found Adrian in the crowd and reminded him, laughing, that she still owed him a proper dinner, not one he had to serve, this time, but one he got to simply sit down and enjoy. Watching the crowd, Adrian finally understood something Elena used to tell him, back before everything changed. Courage rarely looks the way people expect it to. Sometimes it isn't a boardroom decision made by someone powerful. Sometimes it's a tired man in a waiter's uniform, holding a tray of coffee nobody asked him to hold an opinion about, deciding that the truth mattered more than his own safety. If this story moved you, let us know by commenting below. Truth still changes lives. And if you want more stories like Adrian's, make sure you're subscribed, because the next one might be even more powerful. As the sun went down over the training center that evening, Mabel slipped her small hand into her father's, and for the first time in a long time, Adrian felt something settle in his chest that felt a lot like peace. Because sometimes, the person who saves everything isn't the billionaire in the room. Sometimes, it's the man everyone forgot to look at twice.